When Jimmy Kimmel hit the president with a question about Baron Melanian and Ivanka, the room went silent. What followed was a tense, fiery exchange that no one could look away from. This was more than a talk show. It was a confrontation the nation won't forget. It was a night that felt ordinary at first. The lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and the audience was filled with the usual mix of laughter, chatter, and excitement. People came expecting a fun evening. One of those classic Jimmy Kimmel shows where guests share stories, joke around, and keep things light. But this night was different. Far from the casual interviews and playful banter the audience had seen so many times, the atmosphere carried an unusual tension, one that would become impossible to ignore as the evening unfolded. President Donald Trump, already a figure who never did things by halves, had agreed to appear on the show. By 2025, Trump was serving his second term, and his presence alone always commanded attention. But no one could have predicted just how electrifying this particular interview would become. The moment Trump entered the studio, the usual excitement in the air took on a sharper edge, almost like the room itself sensed that something unexpected was about to happen. The conversation began in a normal fashion at first, the kind of light chatter that might cover whether a recent trip or a public event. Then, almost without warning, Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward with a question that made the entire audience gasp. It was the kind of question no one had really anticipated. Calmly, but with an unmistakable intensity, he asked, "Mr. President, what do you say to claims from Barack Obama and Jasmine Crockett? They say Barron isn't Melania's son. He's yours and Ivanka's. What's your take?" The reaction was immediate. For a moment, Trump froze. His confident demeanor, which usually seemed unshakable, wavered. The audience collectively held its breath, caught in the tension of a single pause. There was a heartbeat of silence that stretched just long enough for everyone to realize that this was no ordinary question, no simple political jab. This was a question that struck at the very heart of the president's private life, something that had been whispered about for years, but never addressed openly. The weight of it hung heavy in the room. Trump's mind raced, though no words came out. He shook his head, an almost imperceptible motion, but it spoke volumes. It was a small gesture, yet it said everything. He wasn't going to answer ice, and just like that, the air shifted. What had started as a routine late-night show began to feel like a high-stakes confrontation, a clash that everyone in the room would remember for years. Jimmy's calm gaze didn't waver. He leaned in, patient yet relentless, waiting for Trump to respond, knowing that silence itself could be as revealing as any statement. The audience sat in a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Whispers ran through the crowd as they tried to make sense of the moment. Some were stunned by the question itself. Others were fascinated by Trump's reaction, or lack thereof. Even those who had seen Trump in countless interviews could not recall a time when he had been caught so visibly off guard, forced into a moment where the spotlight illuminated something deeply personal. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the strategist, didn't rush. He let the pause linger, allowing the tension to build naturally. He knew that a question like this couldn't be rushed or defined. The power of it lay in the truth-seeking nature of the moment. Everyone in the audience could sense that something significant was happening. This wasn't about politics, about slogans, or about party lines. It was about confronting a claim that had always been whispered in private, but had never been addressed. In a public forum, as Trump shifted in his seat, trying to regain composure, the audience's anticipation grew. It was as if the entire room had collectively leaned forward, waiting for the inevitable reply. The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Jimmy's eyes didn't leave Trump. They were steady, almost piercing. It was the look of someone who knew exactly how much weight words carried and how far-reaching the impact could be when the truth, or the perception of it, was finally brought to light. The president, usually quick to respond with confidence, and often with a hint of showmanship, seemed momentarily trapped. Every movement, every blink, every slight shake of the head became amplified in the silence. The audience watched as Trump processed the question, weighing the consequences of speaking versus holding back. It was a rare glimpse into a public figure confronted not with policy or opinion, but with a deeply personal claim that demanded acknowledgement. Time seemed to stretch. The usual rhythm of a talk show, jokes, applause, laughter, was replaced by the raw, unfiltered weight of reality. Jimmy didn't force the moment. He allowed it to breathe, letting the audience sit in the tension and imagine what might come next. What would Trump say? Would he deny it? Would he stay silent? Would he explode in anger? Or would he find a clever way to sidestep the question? For viewers, it was mesmerizing. The ordinary world of late-night entertainment had shifted into a moment of history unfolding live. One question, delivered with calm precision, had set in motion a chain of reactions that no one in that studio would forget. And as the silence stretched on, filled with the audience's collective anticipation, it became clear that this night would be remembered not just for the question itself, but for the way it had changed everything. The tension, the uncertainty, and the promise of what was still to come. In that moment, the stage was no longer just a stage. It was a space where private whispers collided with public scrutiny. It was where the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary. And at the center of it all, Jimmy Kimmel sat calm and steady, ready to see exactly how far this unexpected showdown would go. After the initial shock of the question, the room was filled with a tense hush. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment. The claim about Barron's parentage wasn't something that could be brushed aside easily, and yet, Trump seemed determined to avoid giving it the attention it demanded. For a moment, he simply leaned back, shoulders stiff, and said, "I'm not talking about that nonsense." The words were calm, but the firmness in his voice carried an unmistakable edge. It was the kind of statement that tried to shut down the conversation without escalating it further. But Jimmy Kimmel, with the patience and persistence that had defined his career, didn't allow it to end there. He leaned forward and spoke with steady clarity. "Come on, sir," he said, his tone even but unwavering. "They even claim there are DNA reports proving it. Your silence is making people ask even more questions. What gives?" The audience shifted in their seats, murmuring to each other. The tension was almost tangible, like a rope being pulled taut. Every eye in the room was on the two men. The claim itself was explosive. But what made the moment even more gripping was the way Trump handled it. He had faced criticism, scandals, and tough questions before, but this was different. This was personal, and his usual defenses seemed to falter under the directness of Jimmy's approach. Trump tried to regain control. "No comment. I won't go there," he said, repeating himself, each word measured and deliberate. It was a tactic he had used countless times in the past, refusing to engage, waiting for the topic to lose momentum. But this time, it wasn't working. Jimmy didn't back off. He continued to press calmly, deliberately, almost like a teacher challenging a student who was avoiding a difficult truth. "You've stayed silent on this long enough," Jimmy said. "People are talking, and they want answers. Why not just address it?" Trump's jaw tightened, a subtle but visible sign of frustration. He shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at the audience as if seeking support, or perhaps a distraction. But the audience didn't look away. They were riveted, hanging on each word. The tension in the room kept building, and for the first time, you could see Trump struggling with how to respond. Every instinct he had for avoiding conflict, for controlling the narrative, was being tested by Jimmy's steady insistence. The exchange became almost like a game of mental chess. Trump would deflect, hoping Jimmy would relent. He would dismiss the claim as nonsense, repeat his refusal to answer, and maintain a composed exterior. Yet, Jimmy didn't give ground. Every question was precise, every follow-up measured. There was no yelling, no mocking, just a quiet, relentless pursuit of clarity. The audience could see the tension rising like a storm about to break. Trump's usual confidence was replaced by a careful calculation. He wanted to maintain control to avoid embarrassment. But Jimmy was carefully stripping away every possible escape route. The questions weren't attacking his policies, his politics, or even his public actions. They were targeting a deeply personal claim, something that had been whispered about for years, but had never been confronted head-on in such a public way. And in that confrontation, Trump was on unfamiliar ground. Jimmy spoke again, his voice steady and calm. "Sir, the claims aren't going away. People are asking questions every day. It's better to address them than let rumors fester. Can't you at least give some clarity?" Trump paused. He considered speaking, perhaps to deny, perhaps to deflect, but nothing came out immediately. His mind was clearly racing. In previous interviews, he had always found a way to control the narrative, to turn questions in his favor. But Jimmy's approach was different. It wasn't about ridicule or confrontation. It was about persistence and precision. Every question was like a key trying to unlock a door that had remained firmly shut. The silence stretched longer, filled with anticipation. The audience could sense the pressure building. Trump shifted again, his hand brushing over the microphone, a subtle gesture that betrayed the unease he was trying to hide. Even his breathing seemed sharper, as if the weight of the question had settled on him physically. Then, almost as if he had reached a limit, Trump finally spoke again. "I've said all I'm going to say on this," he declared, his tone firmer, more controlled. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He continued calmly but pointedly, pressing the issue without anger. "Sir, silence isn't the same as an answer. People want truth. It's not about politics. It's about clarity. If you don't address it, the question doesn't disappear, it only grows louder." The back and forth continued, each moment heightening the tension. Trump dodged, sidestepped, and deflected, while Jimmy stayed relentless. Pressing for an answer without raising his voice or attacking personally, It was a battle of persistence against avoidance, clarity against evasion. And as the audience watched, it became clear that this was no ordinary interview. This was a rare glimpse into a confrontation where facts, questions, and personal claims collided, forcing a public figure to confront something that had long remained hidden in shadows. Every moment added pressure. Every repeated dodge from Trump made the audience leaning closer, curious about what might come next. Jimmy's calm determination contrasted sharply with Trump's increasingly visible frustration, creating a tension that was both electric and impossible to ignore. The room felt charged with anticipation, a collective curiosity that grew with every passing second. By the time the segment reached its next turning point, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. The usual boundaries of a late-night interview had dissolved, replaced by a dynamic where persistence and truth-seeking challenged power and secrecy. Trump was on the defensive, dodging each question. But Jimmy's persistence made it clear that the confrontation had only just begun. The audience knew they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered not for jokes or light chatter, but for the rare, unflinching pursuit of answers in a world where avoidance often feels easier than truth. After a tense back and forth, in which Trump had dodged question after question, the atmosphere shifted. The silence was heavy, filled with expectation. Everyone in the room had seen Trump handle criticism before, but this was different. This wasn't about policy, trade deals, or election results. This was personal, hitting at family and reputation, subjects where Trump rarely faltered. And yet, under Jimmy's calm, unrelenting questioning, cracks began to show. Trump's initial response had been a firm refusal. "I'm not talking about that nonsense. No comment. I won't go there." But repeated questions posed without judgment or mockery had chipped away at his composure. You could almost feel the tension building like steam in a kettle. And finally, Trump reacted in a way that was unmistakable. He struck back, sharp and unrestrained. "They are un-American," Trump said, his voice rising, carrying the force of someone suddenly pushed into a corner. It wasn't just a denial anymore. It was a declaration, a defense, not just of himself, but of what he considered to be his principles. "I don't answer. Anti-American attacks? That's it." The audience, still caught in the spell of the previous tension, paused, unsure whether to cheer, gasp, or sit in stunned silence. This wasn't the calm, measured tone of a press conference. This was raw emotion, a reaction stripped of filters. It was clear Trump felt attacked, not politically, but personally, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Jimmy's reaction was subtle, but meaningful. His eyebrow raised slightly, a silent signal that he had anticipated the rebuttal, but was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't intimidated, and that only seemed to escalate the intensity of Trump's response. "You should stay neutral," Trump continued, his tone growing sharper, more direct. "Stop yapping for some individual over an envelope." The words hung in the air, bold, cutting, and unplanned. They carried an accusation that was impossible to ignore. Trump was suggesting, in plain language, that Jimmy was acting not as a neutral interviewer, but as someone influenced by outside forces. It was a rare public accusation, one that blurred the line between critique and personal confrontation. The audience's reaction was immediate. A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed the claim. Jimmy, the picture of composure, didn't respond verbally, but the tension between the two men grew almost tangible. What had begun as a calm attempt to get answers had escalated into a direct, almost confrontational exchange. Trump's words were no longer just a defense, they were a challenge. Trump pressed on. He framed the claims, and Jimmy's persistence, as not just personal annoyances, but as attacks on patriotism. "I don't answer anti-American attacks," he repeated, as if to make it clear that any questioning on this topic was beyond the bounds of decency. In his view, he wanted to frame the narrative in his terms, shifting the focus from the personal claim to the broader idea of loyalty, patriotism, and offense. It was a strategic move, turning the spotlight away from the specific claim and toward a principle he could defend publicly. Jimmy, however, remained unshaken. He had built his questions carefully, calmly, and with precision. He wasn't here to provoke an emotional outburst. He was seeking clarity. And yet, Trump's escalation made the moment undeniably dramatic. The audience could feel it. The shift from a quiet tension to an emotional standoff. What had been a careful questioning had become a clash of wills, and the energy in the room reflected that change. Trump's statements were sharp, fast, and unapologetic. He seemed determined to assert dominance over the conversation, to reclaim the space after being pressed repeatedly. Every word was loaded with intent, designed not just to defend himself, but to challenge Jimmy personally. The language was fierce, almost combative, signaling that the president was now fully engaged in the confrontation. As the words hung in the room, The audience was drawn deeper into the scene. You could feel the stakes rising with every exchange. Trump's tone was commanding, insistent, and bordering on accusatory. Jimmy, in contrast, remained calm, almost detached, which only amplified the tension. It became clear that this was no longer an interview in the traditional sense. It was a battle of persistence versus force, calm versus fury, questions versus deflection. Even as Trump's words grew more pointed, he also revealed the pressure of the moment. His gestures, the slight tightening of his jaw, and the intensity in his voice all suggested that he was being pushed beyond his usual comfort zone. The topic was one he rarely, if ever, addressed publicly. And yet, here he was, forced into a defensive stance under the relentless scrutiny of an interviewer who refused to back down. The exchange reached a point where it felt almost personal. It was no longer a simple question and answer. It was two people confronting each other's boundaries. It's testing how far one would go to maintain composure and how far the other would go to get a response. Trump's words had heat and immediacy, but Jimmy's calm persistence created a counter, a steadying force that prevented the moment from turning chaotic. By the end of this intense exchange, it was clear that the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Trump's responses, full of fire and accusation, had transformed the atmosphere from tense curiosity to gripping confrontation. Jimmy's calm persistence had forced the president into a corner, compelling him to react with emotion and intensity that few had seen before. And while Trump had struck back with all the force he could muster, Jimmy remained unflinching, ready for the next move, creating a tension that was impossible to ignore. This was more than an interview. It was a public clash of wills, a test of composure, and an unforgettable moment that illustrated the power of persistence, clarity, and courage in asking difficult questions. The audience, watching every exchange, could feel the tension ripple through the room and understand that what they were witnessing was extraordinary, a confrontation that would be talked about long after the camera stopped rolling. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Trump had fired back with sharp words and accusations, but Jimmy Kimmel wasn't backing down. In fact, he leaned further into the confrontation, his voice calm but firm, carrying the kind of determination that made it clear this wasn't going to end quietly. This was more than a debate or a heated exchange. It had transformed into a full-blown challenge, a moment where one man demanded answers from another on questions that had long been left in whispers and speculation. Jimmy's next words hit hard. "What's the real story behind Barron's birth?" he asked. The question wasn't subtle. It was direct, precise, and impossible to ignore. The audience held their breath. Years of rumors, hints, and speculation had surrounded this topic, but no one had confronted it so openly, so publicly. Jimmy's question cut straight to the heart of the mystery that had lingered in the background for years. And in that moment, everyone in the room felt the weight of it. Trump's reaction was immediate, a sharp tightening of the jaw that spoke volumes. He had avoided this topic before, deflected questions, and dismissed claims as nonsense. But the insistence in Jimmy's tone left no room for simple evasion. The question demanded a response, and yet Trump's usual strategies of humor, diversion, or dismissal were failing to offer any relief. For the first time in a long while, he was confronted with a direct challenge that he couldn't easily navigate. Jimmy didn't stop there. He pushed further, expanding the scope of the questions in a way that forced the audience to lean in even closer. "And what about all those rumors of your inappropriate connection with Ivanka?" he asked. The words were shocking, but delivered with a composed, steady cadence that made them impossible to ignore. This was no sensationalist jab. It was a relentless pursuit of clarity, a demand for answers that many had been curious about, but too afraid or too polite to ask. The atmosphere in the room was electric. The audience, already captivated by the earlier exchanges, now found themselves on edge, hanging on every word. The questions were sharp, provocative, and deeply personal, and they were being asked with a level of persistence that made it clear that Jimmy was not here to play games. Every person watching could sense the stakes rising. This wasn't just about one person's reputation. It was about confronting decades of secrecy, about bringing whispers and speculation into the light in a way that could no longer be ignored. Trump shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. He had dealt with criticism, scandals, and allegations before, but Jimmy's approach was different. There was no mocking laughter, no playful quips, no attempt to trivialize the moment. This was serious. This was a question-and-answer match, where persistence met avoidance, where every word carried weight. And Trump could feel the pressure building, a pressure that was intensified by the audience's expectation. The quiet hum of curiosity and the undeniable truth that his silence was being noticed by everyone in the room. The tension built incrementally, like a storm gathering strength before breaking. Every dodge, every deflection, only made the next question hit harder. Jimmy knew that in moments like this, clarity and calm could be more powerful than aggression. He continued, voice steady, eyes focused, making it impossible for Trump to escape the reality of the moment. The questions were no longer just words. They were demands for accountability, a call to confront truths long kept in shadows. Trump's face betrayed the inner struggle. He had long relied on charisma, deflection, and control to navigate tricky situations. But here, confronted so directly, he had to find a way to respond while protecting his image, his reputation, and his dignity. Each pause, each hesitation revealed a subtle vulnerability. It was a rare glimpse into the human side of a man who so often appeared untouchable, invincible, and the audience could feel it, too. There was a collective awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding. The questions, though provocative, were framed in a way that demanded reflection, honesty, and consideration. Jimmy wasn't attacking for the sake of spectacle. He was pressing for understanding, for truth, for clarity. And Trump, powerful as he was being forced to confront matters he had long avoided, to respond under a level of scrutiny that few could withstand. As the minutes passed, the tension escalated further. Each follow-up question was like adding fuel to a fire. Jimmy's persistence wasn't aggressive. It was precise, deliberate, and unyielding. He created a situation where the audience could see the full scale of the challenge. A public figure confronted with personal allegations, pushed to respond, invisibly struggling to maintain composure. Every word, every glance, every gesture told a story, painting a vivid picture of a man grappling with the weight of the moment. Finally, it became clear that the situation was nearing a breaking point. Trump's usual defenses, denial, distraction, dismissal, were being chipped away by a steady, calm insistence that left no easy exit. The questions were sharp, unflinching, and relentless. And it was evident that Jimmy was not going to let this moment pass without pressing for answers. The audience could sense the buildup, the quiet anticipation of a climax that seemed inevitable. By the end of this explosive challenge, the stage was set for the next dramatic moment. Trump was visibly rattled. The pressure of the questions, pressing heavily on him, and the audience was completely absorbed, knowing that what came next could change everything. Jimmy Kimmel's relentless pursuit of answers had created a confrontation unlike any the audience had seen before. A challenge that was personal, provocative, and impossible to ignore. It was a rare moment in television history. A public figure, being pushed to the edge by questions that went beyond policy, politics, or public image, and forced to confront whispers, speculation, and secrets in real time. The intensity, the tension, and the drama were palpable, leaving everyone watching on the edge of their seats, waiting to see what would happen next. The room had been tense from the very first question. But now, after an exhausting and explosive exchange, it had reached a breaking point. Jimmy Kimmel's relentless questioning, sharp and unwavering, had pushed the conversation into territory that few had ever witnessed on live television. Trump, powerful, unflinching, and accustomed to controlling every narrative, was beginning to show signs of real frustration. Every dodge had been met with persistence. Every deflection met with another pointed question. The energy in the room was electric, heavy with anticipation, as if everyone sensed that the climax of this confrontation was about to arrive. Trump shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, eyes flicking around, as though searching for an escape. He had handled countless interviews, debates, and media moments in his life, but this was different. Jimmy's questions had cut through the usual defenses, touching on family, reputation, and personal history, the areas that even the most seasoned politicians guard most fiercely. Each question had been like a spark, lighting a fire that now burned brightly under the surface. Jimmy.com and deliberate, pressed further. The nation deserves clarity, he said. People have been waiting for answers for years. Why stay silent? What are you hiding? The words hung in the air, sharp and insistent. Trump's usual ability to deflect or charm his way out of difficult situations seemed to falter. The audience felt it too, the rising tension palpable in every gasp, every shifting seat, every breath held in anticipation. Trump's lips tightened, his usual confident posture giving way to subtle signs of strain. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then spoke in a measured but cold tone, trying to regain control. You keep yapping, he said, the words carrying a warning, an edge of frustration, and a hint of finality. I won't sit here much longer. I'm leaving. The statement hung over the room like a declaration of war. It wasn't just a threat. It was an announcement that the confrontation had reached its peak. The audience, already on edge, leaned forward, collectively holding their breath, wondering if he would actually walk away. There was an electric pause, a moment that felt suspended in time. Then, just like that, Trump rose from his seat. The authority and confidence he usually carried with him was still present, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of tension, a visible reaction to Jimmy's relentless questioning. He moved with purpose, determined to make his exit without giving an answer, without yielding anything, and without appearing vulnerable. It was a dramatic act, signaling that the conversation had pushed him to the limits of his tolerance. Jimmy, for his part, didn't flinch. He had anticipated this possibility, had prepared for the potential of a walkout, and yet the reality of it hitting in real time carried a unique intensity. His expression was steady, calm, and almost triumphant, reflecting a deep understanding of what had just transpired. He had succeeded in pushing questions to the surface that many had been hesitant to ask, that others had avoided for fear of confrontation or discomfort. The audience erupted in mixed reactions. Some cheered, applauding the audacity of the moment and the bravery of Jimmy's persistence. Others murmured in surprise or disbelief, caught off guard by the sudden exit and the raw confrontation they had just witnessed. Phones were out capturing the scene, faces reflecting amazement, shock, and intrigue. Everyone was aware that this wasn't a routine show segment. It was a historic moment, a real-time clash of power, persistence, and personal confrontation. As Trump exited, muttering under his breath, the energy in the room shifted. What had been tension turned into reflection as everyone considered what had just occurred. No answers had been given, but the act of confrontation itself carried meaning. The questions had been asked, the claims brought into the open, and the audience had witnessed unfiltered, a rare glimpse of a public figure being pushed to the edge. It was a moment that demonstrated the power of inquiry and the weight of persistence, showing how even those at the highest levels of influence can be rattled when confronted with difficult truths. Even in leaving, Trump's presence lingered. The walkout was not just an exit. It was a statement, a visible acknowledgement that the confrontation had struck a nerve. It was an undeniable moment of tension, a vivid demonstration of how high the stakes can get when questions challenge personal secrets, long-held assumptions, and public perception. The audience was left processing what they had seen, aware that the silence left behind carried as much impact as any words could have. For Jimmy Kimmel, this was more than a victory of persistence. It was a testament to the power of asking difficult questions without resorting to mockery or sensationalism. By maintaining calm, clarity, and focus, he had forced a conversation that had long been avoided, revealing not only the limits of Trump's comfort, but also the broader lesson that persistence and courage can bring even the most guarded truths to light. The aftermath of the walkout lingered in the air. The conversation sparked spontaneously among audience members. Discussions erupted online and in homes, and people reflected on the dynamic of the exchange. It was a moment that went beyond entertainment. It had become a cultural touchstone, a vivid example of confrontation, power, and the human side of public figures under pressure. Questions remained unanswered, but the drama itself told a story, one that would be remembered for its intensity, audacity, and the way it held an entire room and indeed a nation in suspense. Ultimately, the dramatic walkout was more than a showstopper. It was a demonstration of what happens when accountability meets deflection, when persistence meets power, and when public curiosity confronts private secrets. The room had witnessed a clash that would be remembered, dissected, and talked about for years. A reminder that even the most powerful people are not immune to pressure, persistence, and the relentless pursuit of answers.